The day Queen Elizabeth died, something shifted for Camila in a way she didn't immediately understand. No one told her directly. There was no announcement aimed at her, no private warning, no dramatic confrontation. But quietly, on September 8, 2022, the ground beneath what she had always treated as her future began to change ownership. And the strange part is this: the person it shifted toward was the one person she might have least expected to ever hold that kind of power. But how did a single death reshape something so personal without anyone saying a word? For decades, the public story of this triangle felt simple. Diana was the wife. Camila was the other woman. Charles was the man trapped between them. It fit neatly into headlines, easy to understand, easy to repeat. But real lives don't stay that clean. Diana died in 1997 in a Paris tunnel at just 36 years old, long after her marriage had already collapsed. And yet even after her death, the story didn't end. Camila remained. She eventually married Charles in 2005, and by 2023 she stood beside him at Westminster Abbey wearing a royal tiara, as if the story had finally closed. But had it really ended? Or had it only changed shape? Because there was a moment that never left public memory. Diana once said on television that there were 3 of us in her marriage. She didn't just hint at it. She named it. And that single line echoed far beyond that interview, shaping how millions saw everything that followed. Around the same time, recordings linked to Charles and Camila surfaced, and suddenly private words became public property. Humiliation spread across newspapers. And while all of that unfolded, Diana's 2 young sons were growing up inside it, reading headlines most children should never have to decode. But what does that kind of childhood actually do to someone as they grow up? One of those boys was William. He was 15 when he walked behind his mother's coffin in 1997, surrounded by silence, horses, and an entire nation watching in grief. He has rarely spoken about that day in detail. But over the years, fragments of his feelings have surfaced through people close to him. Some say the hardest part wasn't the funeral itself, but knowing who he believed had caused his mother's pain was still there, still close to his father, still part of the world he would eventually inherit. Now here's the question. What happens when that boy grows up and inherits not just memory, but real power? Because what William inherited is not just symbolic. It's structural. The Duchy of Cornwall is a centuries-old estate created in 1337, covering land, property, farms, and commercial holdings across England. It doesn't pass through sentiment or negotiation. It transfers automatically to the monarch's eldest son when they become heir. No discussion.
No adjustment.
And that means when Queen Elizabeth died, control of that entire system moved directly to William. And yes, that includes Highgrove, the country estate Camila has long treated as a personal sanctuary. But what does it mean when a place someone calls home was never truly theirs to begin with? Highgrove was purchased by the Duchy in 1980. Charles never actually owned it outright. He lived there as tenant of the estate his son now controls. Even as king, he effectively pays to remain there through arrangements tied to the duchy. And that small detail flips the story in a surprising way. Because it means Camila's long attachment to the garden there, the space she has spoken about as therapeutic and deeply personal, sits on land she does not own, and now sits under the authority of William. So the question becomes uncomfortable. What happens when memory and ownership stop aligning? And then the changes began to show in quieter ways. Names that had long been connected to duchy work began to disappear from records. One example often mentioned is Annabel Elliot, Camila's sister, who had worked on duchy-related projects for years. Her role gradually faded from official accounts as new teams aligned more closely with William's own circle. No public statement.
No explanation.
Just a slow replacement of presence. And if no one announces a shift, does it still feel like a shift to the person living through it? There's another layer that rarely gets spoken about openly, but always surfaces in private accounts of the family. Princess Anne's past connection to Andrew Parker Bowles, who later married Camila, has long been part of the family's history in a way the public often forgets. Some close to and describe her as someone who doesn't dwell on emotion, but remembers structure, patterns, and timing. And in that reading of history, Camila is not a new figure. She's someone who has been part of the same orbit for decades. But does memory inside a family ever stay neutral? Over time, the control of estates, residences, and access began to feel less like inheritance and more like quiet restructuring. Staff reportedly began referring to certain ongoing reviews in almost bureaucratic language, as if everything was procedural, not personal. Questions about leases, usage, and future occupancy became routine. But routine questions can still carry heavy implications. Because what happens when the answers never change? Only the tone does. Camila's position, at least publicly, remained unchanged. She still appears at royal events, still moves between residences, still carries out her role as queen consort. But behind that visibility, there are suggestions of a slower shift in influence, shaped less by confrontation and more by structure. Even Charles, dealing with illness in recent years, is described as focused on maintaining stability rather than extending control. Which raises a difficult thought. What happens when one generation no longer has the energy to hold the frame together? And here is the part that turns the entire story on its head. William doesn't need dramatic action. He doesn't need declarations or decisions that make headlines. The system already places him in a position where time itself does the work. Estates transition. Authority follows structure. And structures don't argue back. So instead of a visible takeover, what exists is something far quieter. A slow alignment of everything toward one center. But if power doesn't arrive with a moment, then when does it actually begin? And that leaves one final question hanging over everything. If the homes, the land, and the structure all point toward William, then what happens to the rest of the family when the architecture of their world no longer points equally in every direction? Because in this story, nothing is being taken. Nothing is being announced. And yet somehow, everything is still changing.